warmed up here. For everybody who is in the room, welcome. Really excited that you're here with us tonight. My name's Liberty, and I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective. And tonight we're going to be joined, we are already joined by two authors, Nillin Lore and Kitty Stryker. Nillin and Kitty, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
We're going to be discussing sexuality as trans or non-binary queers in a landscape rife with misogynistic, homophobic, and transphobic ideals and expectations. And it does just feel like this is a more relevant conversation every day that passes somehow. So good to be having it. Just a little backstory in case you haven't joined for any of our other virtual events. Firestorm, the bookstore that I'm part of, is a 16-year-old radical bookstore owned and operated by a queer feminist collective in Asheville, North Carolina, which is Southern Appalachia on the land of the Cherokee people. So Firestorm strives to feature books and events that reflect our interests and the needs of marginalized communities, particularly in the South of the United States, although always excited to have people join from anywhere. And we're continuing to do a fair number of events virtually, like this one, both because it's nice to reach authors and audiences at a distance, and also because we know that there's a variety of barriers to joining IRL events for many in our community, including the ongoing COVID pandemic. So this event is actually the last thing I'm going to do before I leave for Firestorm's winter break. It's a great send-off. But when we get back from break, we've got some great virtual events planned that I would just want to go ahead and invite you to sign up for if you're interested, including one on horror, one on the West Virginia mine wars, and a couple more abolitionist events in the Rattling the Cages series. So we got a good spread for you, and I'll drop a link to our calendar in case you want more information on all that. So for tonight, we are using Zoom on the webinar platform. There's an open chat. If you haven't found it yet, definitely feel free to use that. As we go, if you have questions for Kitty or Nillin, then please put those in the Q&A, which is like a separate little tool in there somewhere. I think what does the icon look like? The icon is a question mark. If you put it there, it won't get lost in the chat. So we'd love to have your questions. We're going to make sure there's a little bit of space towards the end of the event. And it's nice to have a few queued up. Great. So tonight, I haven't even said the title of the book. We're here to celebrate the publication of Nillin's new book, How Do I Sexy? A Guide for Trans and Non-Binary Queers. Perfect. Thank you. Right on cue. And so we'll kind of be having a conversation picking up from there, but I'm sure we'll go in interesting directions. Just to kind of introduce our guests here, we do have Nillin Lore, the author, who's an ADHD, queer, gender flux, polyamorous, and disabled author, content creator, and furry. Out of Saskatchewan, they're a multiple award-winning sex blogger who earned first place in the top 100 sex blogs of 2021. Nillin contributed to the Big Book of Orgasms, Volume 2, as well as Best Lesbian Erotica of the Year, Volumes 4, 5, and 6. They were also a chapter co-author in the second edition of Trans Bodies, Trans Selves from Oxford University Press, and the editor of Heckin' Lewd, Trans and Non-Binary Erotica. These are pretty much all things you can find from Firestorm if you're looking for copies. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us and for making this happen, Nillin.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I was really excited about this event, so yeah.
Yay. And next up, we've got Kitty Stryker, who we've had the pleasure of hosting for events in the past, but it's exciting to reconnect here tonight. Kitty is one of the people who coined the term consent culture, as well as being an anarchist, activist, queer femme, and leftist doomsday prepper located in San Francisco, or the Bay Area, perhaps more broadly. Kitty is a freelance writer with bylines at Teen Vogue, Vice, Rolling Stone, and more, and enjoys playing TTRPGs in her free time. Kitty's books include Ask, Building Consent Culture, Ask Yourself, the Consent Culture Workbook, and most recently, Say More, Consent Conversations for Teens. Kitty, thanks for being here and for writing all these great
Absolutely.
books.
Thanks for having me.
And I understand that there's a bit of a blizzard happening where you're at, Nillin. So
Yeah.
really appreciate the extra effort in being here despite the bad weather.
I'd never miss it. Blizzard or no. Blizzard is nothing. I'm
Well,
in Saskatoon, so we get a blizzard every other week. It's good.
all right. Well, your electric grid is probably a little better than ours here in Southern
Probably, yeah.
Appalachia, where it goes down just constantly for no reason.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no. Ours is pretty sturdy.
Great. Well, I'm going to pass off to you. Thanks and take it away.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really excited to be talking about this. With my release of How Do I Sexy. It's my first major solo book release. And it's essentially more or less part memoir, and mostly self-help is how I've been kind of describing it. And so what that basically means is I'm going to be sharing, very intimate aspects of my own kind of journey through gender identity and growth and transition, as well as, the ups and downs of interacting with family, society, and trying to find like how to feel affirmed and good in my body when I'm getting all this information around me and when we're getting all this information around us from, culture, news media, social media, friends, community, so on and so forth, telling us how we should be looking, how we should be feeling, what is sexy, and not really leaving much room to define it for ourselves. So How Do I Sexy is my effort to show you how I define my own sexy and hopefully give you some guidance in how to do so for yourself as well. Yeah, that's about it in summation.
Well, that leads really nicely into my first question, which is, yeah, that sounds good. How?
Yeah, right.
Like, the world makes us feel ashamed of our desires and our bodies. I do want to acknowledge I am a cis queer femme who is also asexual. So, there are definitely aspects of this book that speak to me, even though it's not for me, which I thought was really, really great. And I guess I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit about like, how do you figure out what you find sexy in others and in yourself? And then how do you figure out what is genuinely your sexy versus a projected ideal pushed on you?
Clumsily. It would be the best summation of that. The information that we're getting is so overwhelming in general. Like it's even for myself that on the day that I feel most affirmed, the most hot, the most sexy, I still wonder, like, is this me? Or is this how I think it should be me, right? I know that when I first came out as trans, and it was great to have a lot of community around me. I had between a mix of allies as well as other trans women. But one of the things I kind of noticed right away was this insistence on people giving it unsolicited advice, right? It's like, oh, you're trans, so this means that like, oh, you want to be femme. And so all of these, like, especially unfortunately cisgender women, seem to think that the best thing that they could do for me is tell me how to be a woman. And on one hand, it's a nice little effort sort of thing. I appreciate, the sentiment. But what that ended up actually doing was just giving me a ton of information on things that I didn't even think were accessible to me at the time. As if you want to be a woman, you have to have long hair. Oh, have you tried, using all this makeup that I had no idea how to use myself? Oh, you shouldn't wear this color. Oh, maybe put on that dress or this skirt. And these are all things like I had never experienced before because I was AMAB, right? Like I came into this as being raised to not really care about any of that stuff for the most part. But what that ended up doing was really jumbling a message for me that the only way to transition was from one extreme to the other. And to be doing so in a body that, like, if I'm being completely honest with you, like I'm a chubbier individual and I've always been kind of larger. And, chubby bodies, even regardless of your gender, on either side of that spectrum, when you're looking at it in a binary lens, it's really hard to feel sexy in those conditions when you're being told that like this is sexy on a slim person, right? And on a white person. And
Yeah.
I remember some of the very first people I met were a bunch of femboys. Awesome people. Really, really cool, really like in your face about it. All 20 something, all extremely thin, all
Hmm.
wearing clothes that it's never gonna fit on me, right? So, you know, in the early parts, I really genuinely think that the best we can really do is to take all that and just keep trying. The biggest thing that I wish I had given myself the permission to do at the time, which I didn't, was to make mistakes and to change my mind. But it felt really scary to do so because I felt like, if I did change my mind, then all of a sudden it's, oh, are you really trans? Right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, right. So like, oh, if you don't want to do this, then like, then are you like, what do you mean you don't want to have bottom surgery? Like, what do you mean you don't feel comfortable super femme? Like, don't you want to be a woman? Um, and of course, that coming from a place of like I hadn't even heard of non-binary people at this point in time, or genderqueer people, or gender flux, or agender, or anything in between. So trying to look at all of that stimulus, and then trying to even look online my favorite shows, my favorite movies. You're looking for little examples and you're trying to pull from it, but it's all in a binary lens. There was so little that was coming in a binary lens. Nowadays, I have to admit, like, so when I first came out at 26, I'm now 38. So when I first came out and started transitioning, at the time there was almost nothing. But like nowadays, like I'm watching like Heartstopper and Heartbreak High and Sex Education, and there's all these like in your face gender queers. And I'm like, oh my God, where were you? That would have made such a
Yeah.
big difference for me at the time. And it just goes to show you that in 10 years, the difference that kind of made, right? So I think that there's really no shame in um, following a path and maybe even going along with like certain things that like are more mainstream or don't feel quite right, but giving you the permission to stop any of it that you don't like. Because there's this huge narrative, even just in terms of your transition, but also in terms of like, how to feel affirmed and sexy, of like, we all have to do this one path, right? It's just like, oh,
Hmm.
you come out of trans, so that must mean you're trans femme, which means you have to immediately get onto Spiro and estro, like, on estrogen, and you have to start dressing like feminine, and you have to want either bottom surgery or top surgery, because if you don't, then are you really even trans? And you, so on and so forth. There's all these rules to go. No, 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 no. Forget all of those. Do only what you're comfortable with doing. And the same with the sexy thing. If you feel sexiest in a tank top and like underwear, and that's what you want to wear, awesome. If you want to wear a skirt with a dress jacket, cool. Like whatever combinations you want to do, whether it's more gendered one way, more gendered the other way, throw in kink kind of gear is a huge thing people don't really realize. Is really accessible to them. As a furry, I'm a big fan of like animal ears, tails, collars, all that sort of stuff. All of which is to basically say that rather than worry about, doing it right, just like do what's right for you. So pick and choose, and you can try a whole bunch of stuff and be like, oh, this is okay, but it doesn't feel good, and then stop doing it. That's okay. Um, and I honestly
Yeah,
genuinely think that's the best you can do. Yeah.
I think that you touch on something that I think is actually super present in culture generally, as we're not to immediately get into like all of the politics
Let's
happening
do
around the
it.
world, but like I think fascism really requires a nailed down understanding of experience. Like it
Yeah.
has to, like everyone has to conform in very specific ways. And if you don't, then you're deviant.
Yeah.
And I feel like hearing you talk about your experience and like, being okay with nuance and not fully understanding, it reminds me a lot of my experience being a sex worker who then realized I was asexual and that's why I liked sex work. And
Awesome.
that wasn't the timeline or like the trajectory that I was expected to feel. Like the fact that I had been a sex worker and then identified as asexual was often taken by others as proof that sex work had traumatized me. But actually, it felt like, no, like the sex work was great because it was performance based, it was very concrete, the rules were clear. I felt very in charge. I mean, I was, even as a survival sex worker, I am a larger, very assortive girl. So, like, I felt very confident bossing clients around. And,
Hell
like,
yeah.
I mean, possibly to my own recklessness, I didn't feel that concerned for my life. Um, but like that, it was always flummoxing for me that I couldn't change my mind. I mean, like, I
Oh
don't know that
yeah.
I'm going to be asexual tomorrow. I might be, I might not be. I don't know. Like, I'm just kind of coasting and seeing what works today and what feels right today. And that also speaks a lot to like the writing I do about consent, where again, I think people want it to be like super clear and static.
Yeah.
And these things often aren't. Like, like I think we agree as people that consent is important. Like
Yes.
everyone said, like, yep, yeah. But even what consent means varies so much from person to person. Like, um, when I was working on my book, I was thinking a lot about the definition of a fish and how we all kind of think we know what a fish is, but the more you try to narrow it down, the more you begin to realize that there are exceptions. And I feel like consent is often the same, where you're like, oh, yes means yes, no means no, except for things like workplace consent,
Yep.
except for medical consent or consent in regards to parents and children. Like that is a good ideal and that is a good thing to strive towards. But I mean, the reality is much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
Um, which leads to another question that I had is like, so, since sex education is harder, increasingly harder to come by, and is often being stifled by forces that want everything to be heterosexist and cisgender and white and for procreation.
Yep.
It's we're kind of getting some mixed messaging, not only from the mainstream, but also, I mean, even within our own communities
Yeah,
about
for sure.
consent being enthusiastic and informed. Like, great when it can be, but I mean, like, how do you inform exactly? Like, what if I don't know myself well enough to inform you?
Yeah.
Does that mean I just shouldn't do anything until that point? So I guess I'm curious, like, the advice is often like, oh, well, how can you do anything? Like, you should know everything about yourself. You should know where you stand before you uh try hormones or before you have sex in a certain way or ask for people to call you by a certain pronoun. But like
Mhm.
that seems impossible. Like we don't live in a world where that makes sense. So like how I guess I'm curious for you to speak to that tension of like we are expected to know ourselves so thoroughly, but we're also not given the tools to know ourselves at all.
Yeah. Well, I think you really nailed it just by using the word expected, right? Like there's all these expectations
Yeah.
that we have put on us and projected on us from all sorts of different angles and backstories, and experiences, right? And so, one of the things that I've come to learn at this point in time is that no matter what I do, whether if I'm transitioning in a way that somebody doesn't think is right, if I'm having sex in a way that somebody thinks is, oh, that seems off or whatever it is, the reality is that like almost all of the like acceptance that I've experienced outside of my close partnerships and friendships has been conditional, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like I get the support so long as I do blank, 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 and blank. And if you deviate from that in any way, then you're kind of hooped. So you're right. How do you possibly, know who you are and what you like if you're being told that you can't even like do that until
You
you
can't
know?
try anything.
That's ridiculous, right? So I think there's ways to like maybe dip your toes a little bit if you're feeling a little bit apprehensive about it. And you got to be careful with it as well. But like there's a lot online nowadays. Whether you find yourself like a Discord group or a Telegram chat or something, if you want to dabble a little bit in discussing things with other Kinksters or BDSM folks, if you want to try sexting, like that's something that you can try to play around with a little bit, or if you even just want to research these things online and watch a couple of videos or that sort of thing. One of the places that I always send people to is Crash Pad Series, because Crash Pad Series, it is a monthly subscription, but like the affirming and like just incredibly diverse like representation of not only like bodies and identities but also like the types of sex people are having on that channel is wild. Like you will see every conceivable sex act
Absolutely
on
everything.
on Crash Pad Series, right? And if you're watching it and you're like, "Ooh, that's not for me," there you go. Now you at least have a little bit of a no in terms of like you're watching an intense scene going like, "Oh, that seems scary." So you're already starting to think about intensity and boundaries just by watching something yourself, right? Um, but it's hard because there is a degree of taking a chance for sure. And I think again, the best thing that you can really do is to just go into it as prepared as possible in terms of maybe you're not quite sure you know what you like, but maybe you do know that if you don't like it, this is what you're going to do, right? Or, maybe you
Hmm.
have, I know that when I was first kind of really getting out there and doing hookups and stuff like that, when I was younger, I was kind of a fool and I did some really not great things. But when I was older, I would give my number to somebody and let them know where I was going so that they knew that like I'm going to go on this hookup, I'm going to go on this date or whatever. I'm going to try some things and see how it feels. There's also lots of like, different sort of sex parties and munches. You can go to a sex party and not have sex, by the way. That is an interesting
Hmm.
thing that a lot of people don't seem to realize, right? And if you're comfortable in that space to kind of watch.
Which is also interesting because I like as somebody who enjoys being in those spaces but
Yeah,
doesn't necessarily feel like participating. There are also a lot of those spaces that are like, yeah, voyeurism's cool, except like not at sex parties. Like it's like we don't, which is so weird
it
to
is
me
really
because
weird. Yeah,
I mean, I understand like you don't want people gawking
yeah.
unless the people have consented to that. But like I went to a party in London, which was fantastic, where a guy came up and was like, "Hey, can I watch you and your partner tie each other up and like jerk off over here in the corner?" We're like, "Yeah,
Yeah,
sure." Like, like that sounds great.
which is
We don't
great
have to interact
communication.
with you
Yeah,
and we can just exist. That's awesome.
yeah,
So like again, I think like it's that fear of nuance
yeah.
that is like so present in sexuality and gender, but is also present in like information, and
Oh,
like
very, very much
the
so.
way that
Yeah,
we talk about the news, like there's this real need for everything to be explicit.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, like just
Well, and I
you
mean,
have to try things.
you do, and you also have to like just be kind to yourself, right? And to say like, maybe I go and do something and I don't like it and I don't say anything and I feel bad about it afterwards. Um, you're not at fault for that. You might not have had that practice. Being able to like kind of give yourself that space to be forgiving to yourself, and if you feel comfortable expressing what you need to express to the other person. But like I remember, again when I was younger, and actually even recently having some like non-consensual experiences where because of trauma, like I shut down. I had no Nick's Nillin, who look at my all the things I write about and like all the work that I do, I couldn't communicate. I couldn't say no. I couldn't say stop. And like that could happen sometimes. So it's really important to also just like come into these things with kindness and compassion for yourself, right? And to say that you're not going to do it perfectly. The other person might not do it perfectly. Um, Thinking about different degrees of the complications of like how well do you know this person? Like, did you have a
Hmm.
conversation beforehand about things? Is it somebody you feel comfortable talking about afterwards? Um, it's a hard space to navigate, and I don't think there's like a gold standard. There's no perfect way to do it, like without kind of jumping in a little bit, right? So. And I know for
Yeah.
myself too, there's an extra complicated layer because like I'm plural as well. And so, as a person with plural, there's like different degrees of myself that maybe conflict with, we want this, but also, we don't want that. And like, so how do I kind of express that in a way that feels good? So yeah.
That sounds like trying to please activists. Like
Yeah,
because
right.
there's that image of this idea of like, oh well, I want to be an ally to the trans community, and
Yep.
this trans person is telling me this, and this trans person is telling me the polar opposite thing.
Hmm.
What do I do? And like when people ask it, I'm just like, just do something, and like
Yeah.
be humble about it. Like
Yeah.
you're not gonna please everybody. Do your best. Acknowledge that your best is going to be imperfect
Yeah.
and that you can constantly strive to be a little bit better. And yeah, you're probably gonna fuck it up sometimes. So that's
Oh yeah.
that's okay. Um, yeah, and I mean also like acknowledging that, I mean, again, like not to say that there aren't abusers out there, not to say that there
Yeah.
aren't people who take advantage. There are also a lot of people who like don't know what they don't know. And like
Exactly.
I think a lot of the experiences that I had that I considered to be more explicitly non-consensual when I was in my more riot girl 20s.
Mhm.
Now in my 40s, I'm like, well, you know, maybe that could be true.
Yeah.
And the damage is the damage regardless. But also, like, I wasn't able to tell this person that that wasn't okay in the moment or even months later,
Yeah.
because I didn't know that it wasn't okay. It took me a long time to figure it out. So, like, if I couldn't figure it out, how could I possibly expect this other person who doesn't live in my head to figure it out?
Yeah.
Um, and like, I think, yeah, that does require a lot of compassion.
It does. And like, and again, it's easier said than done, but like, I try to look at like, so the two non-consensual situations that I can remember, I had one happen just like a few weeks ago, but this was with a friend that I've known for a long time. And then another one happened last summer. So the difference here being that the friend that I've known for a long time, I know for a fact that had I said, "Hey, wait, please stop," they would have. That,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? But I didn't. And the harm was done. And it can be argued that before, basically they had initiated like penetrative sex without really even checking in with me. I had boundaries and agreements with my partners that were kind of being violated in that. I shut down and trauma responded, right? Had I said something, I know for a fact they would have stopped, but I trauma responded and the harm was
Hmm.
done regardless. They could have checked in with me before, like just starting to have penetrative sex with me. I could have maybe said something. We could have talked a little bit earlier at the beginning, woulda, coulda, shoulda. What happened happened. However, then you got to weigh a little bit about like, okay, so like that felt really bad, but like it definitely wasn't, intended or direct or came at me maliciously. Um,
Yeah.
versus a past situation where I had a date with somebody, and I kept explicitly saying like, hey, I need this to not be like sexual. I'm just not feeling that right now. And I have boundaries with my partners. And this person just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and sexy stuff ended up happening. Um, that's very different. That's a
Hmm.
case of like I'm seeing, violation, 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 violation. Um, so yeah, it's
And a
it's
lack of safety if you say that,
yeah, exactly, right?
which,
So
considering the political environment, is increasingly dangerous. I mean, like, who, you can't call the police. I mean, you never really could, right? But
no,
like,
that's the thing, right?
recognizing, like, oh shit, like, if something goes wrong, like, what do I do about it other
Yeah.
than dwell, go to therapy, maybe, like, talk to
Yep.
my community,
Which I do. So
maybe.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
It really comes down to, like vulnerability is scary. And there's no perfect way to do it. And there's definitely going to be hurt, there's definitely going to be harm, but there's also going to be like a lot of pleasure and a lot of fun. Um, and it's taking a chance. Yeah. Doing your
Yeah,
best. Yeah.
yeah. Um, I thinking about that, like, I wonder, I don't know. I'm a big fan, and if this is a question that's uncomfortable, you don't have to answer it, of course. But
Yeah.
like, I find in my writing, I'm often super upfront about, like, hey, here's the times where I fucked up, or like where things were more complicated than I realized, and where I had some hard lessons to learn. And I guess I'm curious about this fear of ambiguity that
Mm.
we're sort of that's drilled into us. Can you like, has that ever manifested, like, from, like, emanating from you? And like, how has that manifested, if so, whether that be like you towards yourself or you towards somebody else?
Yeah, it's the fear of ambiguity is really interesting because that's probably one of the things that I've internalized the most for me too. Like when it comes to queer phobia, that's maybe one of the biggest things that's kind of really like kind of seeped into me sort of thing. I know that like a lot of the choices that I've even made for myself personally with my transition, um, I just started on HRT and estrogen actually like within the last like 6 months. And a big part
Hmm.
of that was like, I was non-binary. I wasn't doing those transitions. There was a weird thing in the back of my head that's like, okay, but if you start on HRT now, then you're betraying yourself because you're the non-binary that's not transitioning, right?
Mm,
Um, but like all these different things about ambiguity in terms of like, identity and expression and desires, trying to make a choice and get in the lane. It's really, really hard to sort that out and find the truth in it for yourself, right? Like, how do you even begin to pick that apart? I happen to be the type of person that will sit up until 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning you know, going, why do I feel this way about this thing? And I got a Word document that's like 5 pages long of literally, okay, well, my dad did this to me at this point in time, and okay, I've seen all these shows, and that was awful. And like I can
Hmm.
really pick it apart and kind of see exactly where it's coming from. But it's still so hard to let yourself just be and do whatever you want to do. Um, I think the hardest thing too is like, it depends on how long that like getting in a box has been pounded into you. It's like harder. Now that I'm getting close to like, my 40s and stuff like that, it's like I'm still trying to unpack everything that my father taught me, everything that my parents taught me, everything, not both my parents, my mom has been lovely. Everything that, I learned in school, everything I saw in film and television saying this is how, this is how, this is how, this is how. And now I'm in a whole world that says, well, not necessarily. It's really hard to deprogram that in a way that like feels good at all. So trying to work through it for myself is again a big degree of taking chances and treating myself with compassion. The funny thing is half the things that I talk about in this book, all these beautiful affirmations, grand beautiful advice, I still suck at doing this stuff myself. I'm
That's like
I
me with my consent book, where I'm
I'm
like,
right.
well, these are all great ideals. And also sometimes I still don't measure up to it.
Yeah, like it's impossible to be a perfect person, and it's impossible to go through the whole thing. The really crappy part being like that voice that's been instilled in us, from generations. And I say generations because I definitely believe in like, I mean, generational trauma is a huge thing with Indigenous folks and stuff like that in general. But like trauma is just passed down again and again and again. I happen to know that like back in my family history, we've had quite a few closeted they identified as cross-dressers and transsexual and stuff like that who never got to be themselves. And actually were really queerphobic and transphobic, passing that down to their kids because of that internalization. And so
Hmm.
it's so here you are existing, carrying all of that with you, plus everything that was instilled in you in your youth. And then there's this part of you that's finally starting to say, oh, I don't have to do this. But it's
Yeah.
surrounded by like a sea of everything saying, yes, you do.
Hmm.
That's an uphill battle. But what's the best story is an underdog story. So
No,
so I
that
say,
resonates a lot because like
yeah.
I came to the conclusion like I'm also plus size and
Mhm.
as a fat person I really struggled with like, well, I feel okay with my body, but then sometimes I don't, and I'm
Yeah.
not sure where that's coming from.
Yep.
And then at some point I realized like, oh, it's not me. It's literally everyone else. Like it's not my problem with my body. It's everyone else's problem with my body
Yep.
that sort of like, I don't know, like bangs into my shell over and over again until
Exactly.
eventually I'm like, oh, some of it's seeped in. But like left to my own devices, I'm very happy with my body. And I don't know. It's for me at least. And again, like I'm cis, so this is more in relation to uh body dysmorphia of a different kind. But like there was a point where I was like, actually, I don't feel this way. And I wasn't raised to feel this way.
Yeah.
This is something that is a you problem, rest of the world. And I refuse to take it
Yeah.
on.
Well, it's interesting too,
Fuck
because like
off.
sometimes like that voice, like, cause like, as a fat person myself too, it's like sometimes that voice inside that says like, oh, like you're not attractive. I do hear it come from me. And I'm going like, why am I thinking about this by myself? And then almost always I look at my social media and I go, oops, I've
Mhm.
accidentally followed like 6,000 very thin young people.
Yeah.
Okay, so you got to be careful about it, right? Before you realize that all of a sudden, if you don't really think about it, but you like I remember I was on Tumblr having a great time, but then I just started to feel awful and awful and awful about myself, and I was saying these really terrible things about myself, and my partner, or friend, was like, what's going on? And then they looked over my shoulder one day while I was on Tumblr, and they're like, Nillin, like we're all the fat people. It's like
Yeah.
you sometimes accidentally um like isolate yourself from affirming resources. So I always say that like, if you're having that bad internalization and those negative self-talk, definitely it's other people's problems. But if it's still there, take a look at just what you're surrounding yourself with for a minute. Just like go, okay, hang on a second. What are the messages that intentionally or not, like I'm taking in?
Right.
right?
Because it could be a bunch of thin people who are very body positive in a lot
Yeah,
of ways, but like just the imagery is enough.
it is sometimes. It really
Absolutely.
is. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about that a lot as it relates to Christianity and evangelicalism, and how, as living in the United States, like like, especially I was raised pagan. I wouldn't have thought, oh, Christian beliefs have like seeped into my system. But
Yeah.
of course they have, because they're fucking everywhere. And like they're not even seen as Christian beliefs anymore. They're
Yeah.
just seen as beliefs. And at some point, like it is really hard, fish don't know what water is, right? Like, because they
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
swim in it. And it very much feels that way of having to like pull myself out and be like, hang on, I don't think shame is something I was raised with. I think that's something that's coming from everywhere else that isn't actually a natural part of my existence.
Yeah.
Um, like I was experiencing that when it came to sobriety. And like so
Right.
many sober groups were very focused on like how not Christian they were. And yet shame was such a huge part of how they influenced you to stay sober. And I was like, that I don't get it. Like,
Yeah,
that's not my
exactly.
thing.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, you can feel kind of crazy, honestly, because like it's treated by so many people around you as if this is just an innate way that the world is. And you're like, is it though? Wait, really? And yeah, I mean, honestly, I do a lot of spreadsheets. That's how I figure this stuff out for myself. I couldn't understand why I was having such a hard time in relationships until I went back through my live journal, and I'm going to really date myself here, my dead journal.
Oh my God.
Um, I know, right? To see like what I had said about relationships I was excited about and relationships that I was devastated by. And by like formatting all of that into a spreadsheet, I was able to say, okay, these are themes. Like these are clearly things that I value in a relationship. And these are things that I don't like in relationships. Next time I get into a
Yeah.
relationship, I'm going to start looking at these things, and like they don't have to be every one of my ideals, and they don't have to display all of my deal breakers, but like recognizing that balance helped me have healthier relationships. Um, I don't know. It's weird. It feels like gamifying these things, but hey, data is super useful
It
sometimes.
genuinely is. I mean, like very similarly, I was having a really rough year with one of my partners last year. We were really, really like at odds, having massive communication issues, lots of kind of like ups and downs, to the point where I was like, what is going on? And so similarly, I kind of had to look back at a broader range, and it became quite clear that we were doing the avoidant and anxious attachment dance, right?
Hmm.
So I'm like, okay, hang on. Shit. And then also looking at the fascination of like, okay, so like I'm in a secure partnership with one of my partners. I'm anxiously attached with this one, but when we started dating, I was the avoidant attached one and they were the anxious attached one, and I was avoidant in past relationships. So what are the things that I'm doing and or ignoring uh that like need some adjustment, right? So
Hmm.
again, putting you put your stat sheet there and you're looking at like what are my triggers, what are my contributions, how am I triggering them to be avoidant, whatever. Um, and just adjusting. I love the idea of when you're as soon as you said look at your stats, I'm like, yeah, seriously, look at your stats. That's such a great
Your
idea.
character sheet.
And like it has nothing to
Look
do
at
with
your skill set.
yeah, it has nothing to do with like looking and comparing it with other people, but literally just looking at your trends and seeing the bad trends in terms of what made you feel not good and the good trends, what made you feel good. How can you bring that into balance? And you can do that towards your relationships, you can do that towards your self-expression, you can do that towards your sex life, whatever. That's amazing. That's a great
Yeah.
idea. Yeah.
That it's funny. My nerd brain went like, yeah, if you think you should be a sorcerer and just
Yeah.
have innate magical talent, but actually you're a wizard and you need to like read a lot of books and that's what fulfills you,
Yeah.
you're gonna go through life feeling incredibly frustrated. But
Exactly.
if you accept like, hey, I'm better at being a wizard, like that's where my stat blocks are, that's where I thrive, then like you can go so much further than if you were trying to like force yourself into this role that maybe doesn't suit you and doesn't
Exactly.
serve you.
So you hear
And
that,
that
all you
role might
wizards?
change.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah, like
thing,
I
right?
mean, you could multi-class.
Yeah,
Hey, you know, like I mean, D&D doesn't really like it, but you can do it anyway.
exactly. D&D doesn't happen without the player, so multi-class.
Yeah. Yeah, Wizards of the Coast.
That's right,
Uh,
wizards, read your books, multi-class.
but like I think again, and that speaks again to this like need for nuance and
Yeah.
this need for ambiguity. I think that came up for me over and over again when I was reading your book about
Mhm.
how like yeah, I get that we all want answers. We want
Yeah.
it to be clear and we want it to stay the same. But tough titties, like that's just not really
Yeah, and I was
how the
trying to
world
like,
is.
cover it in the book as best as I can because I want people to read the book and like and feel that they have a lot of ideas and some different things that they can pursue. But like, yeah, like no self-help book out there, no memoir has the universal answer at all, right? So like,
And be suspicious if they say that they do.
hell yeah, exactly, right?
If
So like,
somebody says they're an expert, mm,
yeah, like really? Okay.
it's a cult. It's a cult.
Exactly, right away. That's a necromancer. That's not a wizard. Um, necromancers are okay too sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, that's
That
fine.
does no necromancer hate. But yeah, so it's like, it's really you got to be careful to not latch onto anything as if it's like burn your idols, right? It's just like
Right.
don't take anything as gospel. And especially yeah, with that ambiguity, like I've written a whole entire book basically that says here's a whole bunch of ideas, but also like good luck. Because like
Hmm.
that's the best you can do. I can't tell you what to do universally in here because I change all the time too. Like right now I'm doing 2007 90s queer with my plaid shirt with a hood and my Zelda t-shirt. Yesterday I was wearing a long black dress with a little overall jacket. It Go with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
go with the flow. Yeah.
And it's so interesting how it's like we're allowed to change. Like, I mean, when you're doing cooking, you know, like riffing is part of the fun of it. And
Yeah.
like when it comes to fashion, riffing is fun. And then as soon as it comes to like anything even vaguely related to like
Yeah.
identity or your body, it's like, oh no, not that.
That's such a good point actually. Yeah, because like yeah, they're all yeah, take a chance, like throw in some pizzazz. But then you try to do it yourself, they're like, oh no, no, no. What would Jesus do?
Yeah,
First of all, Jesus would be like, you fucking rock, guys. I think Jesus was probably
uh,
pretty cool.
probably, yeah. I actually mentor an evangelical teen, and I
Yeah,
remember one time he was like, "Well, I don't think you should get any more tattoos." And I was like, "That's cool. You can think whatever you like. It's my body, and I'll get more tattoos if I want to."
yeah,
But what makes you think that? Like, where does that come from? And like that reframing of like, rather than me getting mad or me being offended, but being curious about like, huh, intriguing that you think you get a say, 15-year-old.
yeah.
What's that about?
So one of my
Led
favorite
us
things
to
too
have a
about
much,
oh
oh,
sorry, what was
sorry.
that? Yeah,
I was just gonna say, like, it led us to have a much more interesting conversation about
yeah,
bodily autonomy and who gets to tell other people what to say or think or do.
yeah. Well, what I really love about having that sort of conversation with adults, especially like really traditional conservative adults, even some that are more centrist and maybe whatever, is for me, I look at every opportunity as to try to be a teaching opportunity the best I can, but also as a little queer gremlin, I love trying to like possibly crack an egg. So, if you're talking to one of those ultra conservatives and they're bringing up these things and you're asking them, okay, but why? But why? But why? Almost always you start to see a certain point when the gear starts turning and they're in their head going, yeah, why? And that's my
Hmm.
favorite facial expression is that even if we walk away and like he doesn't fully support trans people per se, but I got that one little look of like he didn't actually know how to answer the why and the cogs were turning. You did good.
Moments for critical thinking are precious for
They
everybody
are,
in
yeah,
all things always.
really they
Like,
are, yeah.
yeah, I think, and I mean, and what is the polar opposite of that static, secure, like authoritarianism?
Yeah.
curiosity,
Yeah,
right? And
that's
like
true.
nuance and like exploration, like all of these things that are about sort of trying things on and discarding them
Yeah,
without shame, without feeling like that is inherently a bad thing.
exactly.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. There was a piece in your book where you like complicated the idea that you can't love others until you love yourself, or like the do or do not, there is no try. And I guess I'm curious, like, what are some ways that you were able to practice self-compassion, especially when you were first diving into understanding yourself more fully and like maybe hadn't gotten a full handle on it yet?
Yep. Honestly, for me personally, it was finding community was by far the biggest thing
Mm,
because if I can't love myself, other people seem to think I was really cool. So I wanted to spend time with them. Like, why do you think I'm cool? What's the big deal? So the more that like I remember when I first came out too, like I was running my sex blog. I was getting tons of emails about it from my local community and things like that. Um, and rather than pulling away from that, uh, I decided to pursue it a little bit more in terms of like looking for what others were kind of seeing, because you're right, like if you're gonna wait for you to love yourself, like that's first of all that's not fair to you, and like
and what does that
and
mean?
what does that even mean? Yeah, what is the metric for that? And what's the metric for that for people who are neurodivergent? Like I have severe depression, ADHD, and CPTSD. I don't love myself very often sometimes, right? But like that doesn't mean I'm not worthy of it. And that doesn't
Hmm.
mean that I can't have the good experiences. So, I think that like the biggest point of it though, which is kind of unfortunate, is like I think it does take a degree of community, at least somewhat. It doesn't have to be entirely community, but like the more that you're around other people, the more that you're around seeing the vulnerability of other people, and the more that you're around hearing other people talk about their struggles, the more that you're hearing, oh, I felt really bad, like, oh, I feel like a shitty person, or oh, I don't feel attractive. You're going like, holy crap, it's other people too. It's not just me.
Yeah.
They're struggling to love themselves. I'm struggling to love myself. We're showing each other how to love each other and in turn how to love ourselves. So it's kind of this exchange of skill, right? Because like compassion isn't necessarily like compassion can be learned, and compassion can be easier to give out than it can be to receive, let alone to give to yourself. So I feel like self-compassion, you kind of pick up as you're showing it, in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
Um, Also therapy. My God. I'm gonna be completely
Yeah.
honest. I've been seeing my counselor at Out Saskatoon for like I think going on 7 years now, and they're delightful. And like if it weren't for that counselor, oh my God, like just having the other person to kind of talk to a little bit, right? Um, but like even with the practicing self-compassion too, it's like, part of it too is like it's again it's easier said than done, but if you can do it to the best of your ability, starting small, you get a negative thought, challenge it. You don't
Hmm.
have to do it every single time because that's impossible, right? I get a ton of negative thoughts during the day. Some of them you go, yeah, 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 and you move on, right? Some of them sit and they stick with you a little bit, and that sucks. But if you can start to practice slowly but surely, here's a negative thought. Oh yeah, well, fuck you. Here's a positive thought.
Hmm.
That does it makes a difference. It's a small way of doing it, right? Whether you're distracting yourself or taking a moment to even sit down and go like, okay, I feel really crappy or whatever here. But look at this art that I did. Or oh, I feel really happy, like crappy here, but look at all these cool pictures I have with my friends and family, and like they all really like me. You're replacing that negativity with affirmations. And slowly but surely that's gonna start to do a little bit of rewiring in the sense that like you'll get to a certain point when you're going like, why am I having this negative thought? Hell no, I'm great. And that'll start to
Yeah.
happen little bits here and there, right? Yeah.
It's so funny you say that. So for a long time I thought that I dealing with like body image stuff. I was
Yeah.
like, oh God, like I probably don't really like myself, right? And I don't know. It's honestly, I did a lot of psychedelics, and at some point, like
Yep.
every time I would do mushrooms, for example,
Yeah.
I would be like, okay, this is going to be intense. Like, we're going to go in here, we're going to discover some dark, horrible thing in my psyche. And every single time I would just roll around in the dirt, giggling to myself and listening to podcasts about the history of refrigerators or whatever. And it was like, oh, okay, wait, I think I actually like myself. Like I think I'm good
That's
actually.
awesome.
Huh.
Yeah.
And like honestly, I thought that was never going to happen. Like I didn't
Yeah.
think that this world would let me ever be that way. Um, and it didn't happen because I compromised with a society that wants me to fit into a narrow little box.
Right.
It happened because I formed community with so many other communities, like not just ones that were queer, not just ones that were other women or other anarchists, but like I got to know my next door neighbor who runs an auto
Yeah.
shop. And at some point, we started talking about our experiences with substance abuse. And like, I was
Wow.
like, oh
Yeah.
shit, here's a way that we bond. And like, here's an experience that we have in common. I would never have thought that I would share this intimate, vulnerable thing with someone who is like a 60-year-old possibly libertarian Asian man,
Yep.
like,
Yeah.
and yet here we are, and we became really good friends. And like, I think that,
Mm.
I mean, not to be a conspiracy theorist, but like, I think that's what these fascist governments don't want us to do is
No, they don't.
like,
Yeah, you're right.
accept, not only accept that nuance in ourselves, but accept that nuance in each other and be like, hey, man, I know that at the beginning of the pandemic, you weren't sure that COVID was real, but you got there, and I'm
Yeah.
proud of you for that. And like, we can
Yeah.
hang and we can talk about Subaru parts or whatever, Like,
But
it's
yeah.
nice to see that kind of community forming. And I do agree that I think that is one of the strongest ways we can
Yeah.
develop that self compassion, um, and just a stronger community more
Yeah.
generally.
Well, especially considering I remember one of the key points that kind of made a big difference for me was going like, okay, so I'm spending tons and tons of my time and my advocacy lifting up all these other gender nonconforming people. I'm going to their appointments with them. I'm advocating for them for their doctors and stuff like that. Why am I not doing that for myself?
Yeah,
Like that, and there just came this moment of realization of just like they're not different than me. None of them are
right.
better than me. I'm not better than any of them. None of them are more deserving than me. I'm not more deserving than them. But I'm treating everybody else like I'll give them all of these resources and all of this support. But when it comes to myself, I'm not asking for help. I'm not advocating for myself, and I'm getting down on myself. And that kind of sucked, and
Yeah.
just that kind of realization. And then in turn, seeing, some of them starting to offer help in various different ways too. Learning to like take that and accept that rather than try to like push it away. Because again, depending on where you are and who were raised with. Like I was raised by, I was in a military family with the Canadian Forces. We were in Ontario, then we went to Alberta. So
Hmm.
like very, very stringent, like do it yourself. You don't need no help. Lift yourself up by the bootstraps. And that still kind of carried on a little bit, even towards like, the queerness and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, it's just that moment of kind of being like, huh, like I got to be nice to myself too because nobody else knows what I actually need. I know what I need. So
Yeah.
if I'm not gonna do that, if I'm not gonna ask for what I need, if I'm not going to be there for myself, then who else is going to? Yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
Um, one of the things that you mentioned kind of to that effect, in how do I sexy, right?
Mhm, yeah,
Um, is mantras and like having like little phrases that
yeah.
you can say to yourself. And before we take questions, or just talk further, um, what is a mantra that you found helpful? Um, well, actually, I'll split this up. What is a mantra you found helpful in the beginning, and what is a mantra that you find helpful now?
Hmm. So one of the ones I found helpful in the beginning, I'm actually going to go back to my book because I actually had it in the book specifically. And I don't really use it as much anymore because I'm kind of in a bit of a different spot. Hang on a second here. You would think that I would know what page it's on, but no.
I don't know what's in my books, honestly.
I
I just
mean,
write them, and then it's
exactly.
gone.
And you work on it for so, so long. I don't know about you, but you get to a certain point in time where they're just like, how are you feeling? But I'm like, fine, I don't want to look at it anymore. It's
Yeah.
yeah, it's done, right? Yeah,
Yep.
okay, so the big, big one, for me was that I have complete and utter autonomy over myself was a really
Mm,
huge one for myself because at the same time, as you know, um, there came a degree of like finally like centering myself, prioritizing myself, um, and taking that power back was crucial, 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 to me even getting remotely to where I am today. Learning about what autonomy is, learning about thinking and reflecting about like all the ways that that was like taken from me, and given the, like you don't want your aunt to kiss you, but just let her do it. It's family, right? It's just like
mhm.
there's all these little tiny things when you're growing up that you have to let the teacher touch you if they want to touch you, even if you don't want to be touched. Like all these little autonomy things that we're not allowed to have. And then we come to adulthood, and there's this weird degree of still that like what am I allowed to do then? So I'm 18, you say I'm an adult and I can do whatever I
Mhm.
want. But what does that mean? Because like up until this point, I couldn't go out when I wanted to go out. I couldn't hang out with who I wanted to hang out. I couldn't do what I wanted to do. I had to behave different ways in different environments. So what the hell is autonomy? So
Right.
that was huge to me, was learning what that word was, and then um learning to basically do what I wanted, I guess, for lack of a better word. Um And I think that that's kind of crucial when you're first starting out, is like giving yourself that permission to say like, oh, but should I? And like, I don't know. But like, if you're worrying about what your boss is going to think, what your community is going to think, what your parents are going to think, to also kind of think about the fact that like, would something really bad actually happen? And do I care?
Mhm.
Is a big question, right? So for
Yeah.
me, it was like, if I lose my job because they don't like trans people, um what's there for me, and what's the important thing that I can do for like autonomy? What choices do I have to make? Same with my family and questions like that. And for me personally, it always came back to I can't do what's expected of me anymore, because like it's just that's making me miserable. I was having trouble with like
Mhm.
massive like suicidal ideation at that point in time too. And I was like, I'm not going to survive if I keep trying to like do everything for everyone else. So yeah, the big one for me that was hugely helpful was that like I have complete and utter autonomy over myself at the beginning. Yeah,
Do you have one that you like a lot now?
I do, and it's actually very very basic, but it's huge for me. Is I'm doing my best.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, though, that's
Yeah,
solid.
and it applies to so much about like, everything that I'm doing. I've had lots of guilt and shame about being ADHD with the way that I was raised, with people like always, you're what's wrong with you? Why can't you pay attention? You're lazy. Do you even care? Why are you so disrespectful? All these projections that are put on you for what's essentially like you like a developmental disability, right? So um I have all of this messaging inside that's still very anti ADHD. I have all this message inside that's still very anti-queer and trans and stuff like that. Or am I advocating right? Did my book cover everything that it should have covered? Am I forgetting anybody? Did I say something that it really may upset somebody? Um, I want to be open to all those things, but also, if I really obsess about that stuff, that's going to destroy me, right?
Yeah.
So it's like,
Perfect is the enemy of done is
ex
definitely one of the things I
right?
say to myself all the time.
Yeah. So in order to even get through the day lately, I'm doing my best is a huge, huge thing for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about like what mine was. I mean, I guess one from my past that I still use pretty frequently is don't treat someone like a priority who treats you like an option.
Yeah.
Um, and when that was first said to me by one of my best friends, I was very specifically thinking about it in like romantic relationships.
Yeah.
But the more that I've spread that to like my friendships or community activist relationships, communities in general, the more I've been like, oh, actually, like this is sort of showing me a lot of issues of entitlement in all of these different
Yeah.
types of relationships. And that these things take up time and energy. And if I'm going to be
Yeah.
giving my time and energy, then I want to be doing that for people and groups who are excited about that and like, are like recognizing it,
Yeah.
even if they can't give it back.
Yeah.
That's okay. It's just like it needs to be seen on some level. And I think like as an activist, I have a lot of like back and forths with myself about that, where it's like, oh, well, it doesn't matter that nobody thinks of me when it comes to consent culture because it's important that everybody is having the conversation. And that's true, but also it does kind of annoy me.
Yeah, and
Like
I think that's
it
fair.
it is irritating
Yeah.
that something that came out of the conversation of a couple of queer femme submissives about the kink community and the poly community
Mhm.
has been desexualized and defanged. The fact that we were both like really into philosophy and Foucault in particular, and all of that analysis of power was taken out of consent culture
Yeah.
when it got to universities, which is like what? Um, it's so interesting,
Yeah.
to like look at that. And like there is that part of me that's like, it's fine, it's fine. It's good that people are talking about it. And there's a part of me that's like, man, like, God damn it.
I think
Um,
that's fair, honestly. Yeah.
uh, and then I guess one that I use a lot now, and again, I've used this one for many
Mhm.
years now. Um, you make time for what you care about, which sounds shamey at first. But the more that I thought about it, the more I realized that I use that to look at, well, what am I spending my time on?
Yeah.
Like, if I want to think of myself as someone who crochets, but I never make time to crochet, maybe that
Oh,
isn't something I want to do.
yeah.
Like, you know, or like there was a long time where I was really mad at myself because I wasn't reading enough books. And I had
Same. My
identified as a
God.
reader
Yeah.
for so long. But I also have ADHD and
Yeah.
I've been on social media for such a long time that my attention span was shot to shit. And so I was like, well, if reading is important to me, if that is something that I really want to prioritize in my life, how am I going to do
Yeah.
that? And so I found a couple of different ways. I listened to a podcast about like getting yourself reading more often. I joined a couple of book clubs. I, started to share what books I was reading, to like kind of pressure myself a little bit to like keep
Yeah.
showing progress. Um, and like now I went from reading maybe a book a year to reading like 40 books a year. And
Awesome.
it's really because I decided that is something I want to prioritize over going to bars,
Yeah. No,
or
exactly.
watching TV. And like that's not to say that going to bars and watching TV aren't valid choices for other people.
Yeah.
But for me, I was like, oh, yeah, I'm happier if I follow what I want, if I look at what I want to do and I make space to do those things.
Yeah.
Um, and, in exchange, also, it does make me look at other people's behavior sometimes. And I say, oh, like you're telling me that this thing is important to you, but then you're not doing it. So you're like not making time to have quality time with me or to follow through on this commitment
Yeah.
or, and like that's okay. If that's not your thing, that's fine. But then, like, that's a conversation about whether or not that should be on your plate as a priority if you aren't
Right.
going to make it one. Um, yeah, I found that to be a really helpful way of like not scolding myself, but instead just
Oh,
sort of
yeah. Yeah.
responding to what was happening already.
Yeah. Highly related on the reading thing. For sure. I was having a big struggle with that too, but in the last, I think 3 months, I've read 5 books, which is huge for me. And I'm currently reading, I don't know if you've heard about it, about Legends and Lattes. Um,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. I need cozy right now. I just finished The House in the Cerulean Sea, which was really good too. But yeah, like and very similarly, that did take a big thought of like, okay, so how much Netflix am I watching and how much games am I playing? And like, what do I really want right now? And it
Hmm.
you shift things around a little bit. Like I'm not really watching much of anything right now, but like I'm reading more and I'm still getting to game. you just gotta kind of, yeah. That's great
Yeah.
advice too. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I started, like I wanted to think of myself as someone who meditates,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I also really struggle to sit still for like 5 minutes.
Oh, couldn't do it.
So I was like, okay, but what do I want out of meditation? I want
Right.
a moment of being very present. I don't need silence. I don't need to focus on my breath. I'm actually a pretty good breather, in general.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I pat myself on the back of. I breathe well.
Well done.
Thank you. It's on my business card. But like I realized like, oh, well, what if I treat watering my plants as my moment of meditation? That's a task that's going to take
Oh,
me
yeah.
5 to 10 minutes. I have to be in the moment because I have to water the plants. So I have to
Yeah.
make sure that the water is going in the plants and not on the floor. So let me just not do anything else. I'll just be present watering these plants and
Yeah.
like looking at their leaves and like checking in with them to see like what they need and do they have mites again, which they almost always do. And like that felt accessible. So
Yeah.
rather than being like, oh, damn it, like fucking ADHD, why can't I focus? I was like, okay, well, maybe it's easier for me to focus if I am doing something with my hands. So let me
Yeah.
just do it that way. Um, yeah, I think that those kinds of like little incremental changes is part of why I feel like I like myself a lot more is I just stopped fighting it and I just said,
Yeah.
hey, fuck it. This is who you are. So just be that.
And those little oh wow, big picture, those little incremental changes is how you find your sexy.
Yeah,
You got it,
it's upside down. Yeah, there you
I just realized that. Damn it.
go.
I looked in the mirror, meant that. There we go. Yeah, I love that approach, especially with like you're finding mindfulness in whatever ways you can, right? And I feel like you could actually find a lot of mindfulness in even like self-expression, right? So like
hmm
here you are, you want to feel hot, you want to feel sexy, be in the moment, pick out your clothes, put on any makeup that you want to put on. There's so much room there to just be and to like ground yourself and center yourself and find peace in yourself, right? That's awesome. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, like I remember when I realized I couldn't wear high heels anymore, and that was
Yeah.
something that made me feel really sexy. And I was like, oh, this sucks. Like this thing that was like one of my symbols of like
Yeah.
femme sexiness. I can't do, I mean, honestly, they're usually like Doc Marten high heel boots. So like
Yeah.
they had a decent heel, but even so, my feet just cannot do it anymore.
Hmm.
Um, and that was really hard until I said, hey, but you know what's really sexy? Not complaining all the time because my feet hurt. That's hot, right? Like,
That's pretty good. Yeah.
yeah, Crocs, maybe not the sexiest, but goddamn, they're comfortable. And you know what? That's fine.
Yeah.
Perfect is the enemy of good, or done. Like,
Yep.
so I would rather that, and like I think being okay with that, just like being our society doesn't want us to feel okay or to
No.
feel peace or to feel pleasure or to feel joy or to like ourselves at all. So doing that is like super defiant.
It is. Yeah.
And yeah, I think your book is a really good way of like, I like that it encourages people to ask questions
Yeah.
rather than saying, like, here's the answers. Because I think
Yes. Yeah.
a lot of self-help books tend to frame themselves as like, here's the answers to your problems. Read this
Yeah.
and you'll solve your problem with this. And I think encouraging people to think more and to be okay with not having an answer today
Yeah, because those were
is
the
like
worst parts
super
of my early
important.
coming out, right? The worst parts of my early coming out was being told how to do it,
Yeah.
being told how to pass. Those were by far the worst parts. I don't want this book to be doing that. Like I want, it's all about more than anything. I just wanted this to affirm that, here's all the things that you can do, and here's all the questions to ask yourself. Here's all the resources to start to like build towards like a more authentic self. But like you don't have to do anything,
hmm
right? So it's important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Except for buy my book.
You have to do
You
that.
have to.
I'm wondering if anybody has any questions. I've been checking the Q&A area and I haven't seen any. But if anybody has any, like we'll just talk. So no pressure.
Mhm.
But if you do have one or several, feel free to drop it in the chat.
Give them a
Um,
second.
yeah. Well, while they think about that, I'm going to ask the question, what are you doing this next week that you're very excited about in regards to doing sexy in some capacity? Without
That's a
like,
good
you
question.
don't have to give intimate
Yeah,
details, but
no.
like, what's something that's like, yeah, this is really revving my engines?
Hmm. Well, one of the things that I've been doing recently too is on my blog, on the sex blog specifically, I participate in February in something called February Photo Fest. And so the general idea is to post like a nude or a lewd every day of the month.
Hmm.
I'm going to give myself permission to not do that this month, but I still want to participate. And so one of the things that I've been kind of doing a little bit more with my partner Fen specifically is um trying to take some dudes together. So we're going to take maybe a couple this week, but in this particular competition or not competition, sorry, in this particular like photo event, it is by and large cishet people that participate in it. So for us, that's like challenge mode of like how queer can we bring this and like how many different like degrees of sexy queer can we show through like lighting and through clothing and through positioning and all that sort of stuff. So it's been really fun actually to just kind of um um look at myself through a lens as well too here, like whether it's from my
Hmm.
camera, from my
Literally.
perspective, yeah, from like my perspective or my partner's perspective, and to just play with my expression in that sort of um way that's performative, but is
Hmm.
also quite like, we're trying to get each other turned on, we're trying to turn on the people who are reading the blog, we're trying to turn ourselves on. It's really fun right now. And so I guess that would be the big thing that I'm kind of doing this week. And which is why, like, I always try to encourage people that, like, as so long as they're comfortable with doing it is like, take nudes and lewds of yourself if you can, like whether it's in a mirror or a selfie or whatever it is, there's no right and wrong way of doing it, right? So you I found my angles for sure. But like I also try my best to like challenge, putting out the angles that aren't so like I'm confident in and posting
Hmm.
those on the blog. I used to never post pictures of tummy or like soft peen. Like if I didn't have a raging erection, I didn't want it on the blog. No, no, no. That's ridiculous. Nowadays, like you're gonna see tummy, you're gonna see different forms of
I think
erections.
I did like a guide to dick pics because I was so
That's
tired of getting
awesome.
bad dick pics.
To be fair.
And yeah, I was like, oh no, I'm super into soft peen. Like
Yeah,
I think that's super vulnerable and sexy and
yeah,
like it's more mutual in a way. It's less of
yeah.
like, look at this, which I mean is also fun sometimes, but
It is, but
it's also it's an invitation.
I was just about to
It's
say,
the
yep,
beginning of a
yeah,
story.
it
And I
is.
find that so much more
Yeah,
interesting.
that's a very good point. I
Yeah,
love
though I
that
will
framing,
say
actually.
when it comes to dick pics, please, God, stop taking, like, just in general, stop taking dick pics while sitting on a toilet. Like, it's been done, it's not new, it
Yeah,
is bad.
I will
The
give you
lighting in
that.
the
Yeah,
bathroom is usually bad.
yeah,
All I can think about is that you're sitting on the toilet taking a shit. And,
yeah,
like, that is not my thing. I mean, maybe I'm sure there's people out there for whom
I'm
that is
sure.
like, wow, the pinnacle.
Yeah,
Not for me.
no, no.
Uh, I think the thing that this week has made me feel the sexiest
Hmm.
is My partner is moving in with me from Maine. We've
Nice.
been sort of together in a very life partnery sense for like 13 years,
Yeah,
but we've only like in the last year just said, I think we're actually in a romantic relationship. Let's just formalize that.
I love that.
Um, and they were saying like, hey, I'm finding myself drifting a little bit. I could really use some structure in my life, and like I have these skills but I'm not really sure how to level them up, and like I don't know, I feel like I want to get more into hobbies. I feel like I'm spending a lot of time just sitting around, and I was like, oh, are you saying to me that like you want me to lovingly boss you around to tell you what to do? Because nothing in the world pleases me more. Like that is just the best thing.
My love
Because
language. Yeah,
as much as I'm like an anarchist,
Yeah.
like there is something about like I struggle a lot with feeling like I know the right things to do, and if
Hmm.
people just did the things that I suggested, it would just be better.
Yep.
Also, though, I don't believe in authority, so
What a conflict.
um, yeah,
Yeah.
it's hard in this brain of mine. But like that was something that I was like, I've never felt so seen as my
Yeah.
partner being like, "Hey, could you make a spreadsheet of the skills I have and steps I can take to like go the next level on these skills?" It's
Yeah.
like that is to me the hottest fucking thing. Because it not only is something that my partner wants,
Yeah.
but it's something I'm good at. And
Yeah.
so it was like it spoke to these two things in a way that makes me feel useful and makes me feel skillful, um, while also being helpful, I
Yeah.
guess. And it kind of affirms my natural bossiness, which is
Yeah.
always nice.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we're actually talking about this because that is a thing that I do talk about in the book as well too, is that like sexy isn't just about what you wear and how you're putting yourself out there, right? Just as you're saying here, like this kind of interaction that you're having with partner is what makes you feel really sexy too. I know for myself, like one thing that makes me feel like both sexy and just like affirmed and good is like taking on kind of more of a caretaker role. So
Hmm.
like my partner is like a pup, right? And they need to go into pup space a lot. And so, being able to like give them an environment where they're feeling calm and quiet, hand feeding them snacks, giving them little head rubs, bringing them tea. Like it seems really basic, but like that makes me feel really good and makes me feel really hot.
Hmm.
And then afterwards they sometimes present themselves and I go, "Oh, yay. Now it's time for Master Street." Right? Like so yeah, like sexy can literally just be how you're interacting with people as well. Like your dynamic can be something that's sexy to you. Your personality can be something, your hobby can be something that's sexy to you, right? Like
Hmm.
you can find sexy in your own terms and pretty much anything. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I like thinking of it as seeking pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like again, like another one of the paradoxes of my mindset is like, seeking pleasure is really important, but overly seeking pleasure can feel very frustrating. I mean, living in the Bay Area,
Yeah.
I feel like I brush up against that a lot, where there's a lot of people who are really good party friends who
Hmm.
want to hang out with you when you're feeling hot and sexy.
Yep.
And then if you're having trouble, they're nowhere to be seen. Or alternately, there are people who love you when you're in a crisis
Yep.
and don't want to celebrate your wins at all.
Yeah.
Um, and like, yeah, I think it's hard sometimes to find the balance of like, responsible hedonism is good, and
It is. Yep.
also everything in moderation, including moderation. Like sometimes you should just do the thing that feels good.
Yep.
Um, as it harm none, do as you will, right? Like,
Yep.
and like finding that balance. One of the things that I do for pleasure is limiting how much I read the news.
Oh God.
Um,
Yep.
because reading the news takes time away from my ability to enjoy my life.
Yep.
It is important to me to be up to date, but I am not a world leader.
Yep.
I am not going, like, my life is going to mostly stay the same and have the same level of crisis from day to day, which
Right.
is high. So why worry about it?
Well,
Like,
exactly. Especially considering, I often tell a lot of people, sometimes you get that criticism of like, why aren't you doing something all the time? Right? Why aren't you doing something? Why aren't you fighting? Blah, 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 blah. But like, I think you can agree, like you know, um, vulnerable minorities have been fighting all the time
forever.
forever. And
Yeah.
so in a crisis situation like we're in currently, um, there's very, 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 very little that like we can necessarily do ourselves. Like this is the time that our allies need to be stepping up for us. And this is a
Hmm.
huge crucial time because they're the ones with the numbers. They're the ones that you know who the government's going to listen to about trans people? Cis people, not
Yep.
trans people, right? So the
Yep.
more the trans supportive cis people we have telling the government, hey, no, this isn't actually okay, holding leaders accountable, that's who has the power in these sorts of situations. So for ourselves, very similarly, like on my blue sky, and I love my blue sky, but I've muted I mute Elon Musk, I mute JK Rowling, I mute Trump. I can't see it right now. It's causing
Yeah.
literal panic attacks every 5 minutes, and I can't deal with that. So just like, as I was saying there, my mantra is I'm doing my best. And what doing my
Yeah.
best for me is writing my books. It's putting out trans positivity on my blog. It's supporting my community when they need me. It's going to a doctor's appointment with somebody who's too scared to ask for HRT. That's what I can do. That's what I can do right now. And that's great. Yeah.
Yeah,
I see
absolutely.
liberty is here. So
Hey, we're getting close to time. This has been such a delightful conversation full of surprising things. I love so much spreadsheet talk. I have some collective mates that I'm gonna have to make sure come back and listen to this conversation, who will really appreciate that.
I make
Um,
my relationship spreadsheet public. If anybody ever wants to see it, to see how I put it together, like just ask me.
that's
I'm
great.
Kitty Stryker everywhere. I love
Incredible.
sharing it.
Well, we are wrapping shortly, but I wanted to make sure to ask y'all to share with us um, both where folks can see more of your work and also if you're working on any projects right now that you would want folks to know about. And maybe, Nilin, we could start with you since this is kind of your
Sure.
show.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, for my not safe for work stuff, for a lot of the content that I'm putting out for queer and trans positivity, in a very sexual setting, that's mixnillin.com. Otherwise, for my writing, just in general, it's nillinlore.com. So just my first name and last name. Two very different sites, so be aware of that. Right
There
now, I'm
is a
actually
warning on the
yes,
first one,
yeah,
so you will not stumble all the way
yeah.
into it without warning.
Yeah, I make sure that like it's the type of thing too where like it resets every like 3 to 5 days to just give you the reminder of like, hey, you still want to see this? Yeah. Outside of that, right now I'm actually writing two more books for Thornapple Press.
Oh,
I've
wow.
signed, yeah. So I'm writing the next big one is called Carry On: Unpacking Your Internalized Transphobic and Queerphobic Baggage. That I just actually submitted the manuscript. I would say 4 days ago. I'm really really
Wow.
excited about it. I'm also
Congrats.
already exhausted about it. It's still got to go through all the editing, but it's in good shape. And I'm also writing non-monogamy and queer inclusivity for the More Than Two collection, which would be kind of cool. And that one's really heavily focused on actually being written for cis folks who are putting together events in polyamorous and non-monogamous spaces who want to be more inclusive, who maybe are starting to find friends and family who are queer and trans, and they're going, what can I be doing to make my space better? That's what
Mm.
this book is for. Um, and then outside of that, I got an erotica story coming out and Take It Outside from Incision Press. And I'm currently pitching my memoir, which I hope Thornapple
Wow.
also picks up. I also have a
Cool.
pitch with a Jessica Kinsey publisher, but we're not sure how that one's going to go. Okay, I think that's it.
That's an incredible amount of activity.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a bit much. I'm happy though.
As for me, I have a website that I need to update, because I've ignored it for, I don't know, years. Um, but I am also on Patreon. If you do patreon.com/Kitty Stryker, that's basically where I fundraise for my writing. It enables me to, I don't talk about the other kinds of activism on Patreon because they have shown themselves to be a little tricksy about that. But that is also what funds my street medic work. It's what funds my networking work, where I'm networking different groups of activists together. Um, this week, I was able to connect a trans woman who was having a hard time finding work in software to some people who work in software who are trans or non-binary and could help her with her resume and like remote work. So that's all stuff that I'm happy to do. It just takes time. And so people pay for my Patreon, and then that gives me the ability to like do activism on a fairly full-time basis. So that is that. I am also on Medium, which let me find the link to that. That's where I post most of my writing. So, I'm trying to write at least an essay a month. It'll go up there. It'll also go up on the Patreon. I am on Facebook. I don't know for how much longer. I have feelings about Facebook, but also a lot of people do need to see visibility. And I do have a lot of privilege that protects me from a certain amount of danger. So I might continue to use it for those reasons. Also, I might sort of downgrade how much I use it. I'm on Blue Sky as Kitty Stryker. I'll probably keep using that. Um, I am currently on the second draft of my book, Love Rebels: How I Learned to Burn It Down Without Burning Out, I think is the subtitle now.
Nice.
And that is
A great
basically going to
subtitle.
be,
Yeah.
thank you. It's going to be kind of a bit of a memoir slash activism guide on how to be an activist without completely losing your mind and destroying your relationships, including and especially if those relationships are people who have differing opinions about activism than you do. It speaks a lot to my experience being a more of a street medic inclined protest activist and less of a frontliner at protests, while also not being against that. So, like, figuring that out or figuring out how to talk to my dad, who I love very much, but who can have more liberal leanings, about ways that he can be active without alienating him or making myself feel aggravated. And like finding ways to do all of that while also giving yourself a break. I also talk a little bit about like leadership strategies, which is an interesting sort of subsection where I go into like business theory, just because a lot of activist groups don't think about different types of leadership, and there's actually a lot of different types. So yeah, it's just kind of like trying to be a smorgasbord of things that also, usually when I write, I like to feature other voices. I chose not to do that with this one because of the current political climate. I am willing to put myself in the risk of harm's way, not willing to do that for other marginalized people. So you will mostly read about me in this one. Um, sorry, but also I think that's more of a safety consideration than anything else.
Awesome. Well, y'all, I appreciate both of you so much. You're both fantastic writers and conversationalists. Big appreciation to everybody that joined us tonight, and I know folks will enjoy catching this as a recording on our YouTube channel as well. And on that note, I think we're wrapped for the evening. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much. Bye bye, everyone.
Look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night, y'all.